Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome our witnesses, members, and our guests in the audience to today's hearing. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on a hearing entitled ESA at 50, the destructive cost of the ESA. I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted in accordance with Committee Rule 3.0. I also ask unanimous consent that the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Pfluger, be allowed to participate in today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. Is there anyone else we're going to recognize?
Don Fire. I think Don Fire was going to. Oh, I can do it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I wonder if I could ask unanimous consent that Representative Don Byer of Virginia have permission to sit on the dais and participate today?
So ordered.
Thank you.
I now recognize myself for an opening statement. The purpose of today's hearing is to review and acknowledge the destructive cost of the Endangered Species Act. Witnesses will testify to the costs the ESA imposes upon communities, states, ratepayers, businesses of all sizes, other species deserving protection, the environment, our children, and the infirm, among many others. Some here today will no doubt ask and possibly even suggest, given its incredible cost, why hasn't Congress repealed this law? The answer is that we all want species to be safe. We all want to avoid causing species to go extinct. And the ESA was a well-intentioned law attempting to do this. But after 50 years of the ESA and untold billions in expenditures paid many times by small communities and families and not the nation, and with questionable benefits, it's definitely time to come up with a better plan. Today, we will bring the cost of this law to the attention of the nation. Soon, we will introduce amendments to the Act that will improve its protection of species without destroying people and communities, and without costing more money than we can possibly find to address these issues. I'm absolutely certain we will hear from some folks across the aisle in an effort to hide or justify the horrific cost of this law, that today's hearing is simply another effort to get rid of the ESA. It is not, but it most certainly is an attempt to understand the ESA's cost. It is absolutely possible to question the cost of the ESA without questioning the need to protect species, even though some here will say otherwise. Cost does matter. Money isn't free, and understanding what we get for what we spend is always relevant. And there are certainly costs other than just money that will be addressed today. Here are some of the costs the ESA imposes that our witnesses will review this afternoon. 1, the cost incurred by agencies implementing the ESA. 2, the cost incurred by many species as water is taken from them and given to others because of the ESA. The cost of the nation of extraordinary amounts of delay and astounding amounts of money spent on the ESA in the context of NEPA compliance. 4, the cost of community destruction as activities such as logging and forest management are stopped by the ESA. The cost of the young and the old as they breathe air heavy with smoke from wildfires as they ravage our fuel-burdened forests, kept that way because of lawsuits and bureaucracy, creating a veritable Gordian knot of astounding complexity. The insane cost of ESA mitigation credits, a Jabberwocky construct that's driving the cost of electrical transmission, and thus the cost to rate and taxpayers across the West through the roof, and this is not to mention the insane impact this is having on land use and land values. 7, the cost to ratepayers along the Columbia River, far into the billions, as almost $1 billion per year of ratepayer money is being spent on fresh water when the focus should be on the sea. The cost of flood insurance, number 8, the cost of flood insurance, which because of lawsuits based on the ESA, will soon skyrocket in price and time taken to issue such insurance as FEMA becomes the new frontier of ESA compliance. I could easily go on, but I'll leave it to other members to raise the additional costs in their districts of the ESA. What we do know is that the ESA is failing in one of its core missions, recovering endangered and threatened species. As many here know, only 3% of listed species have been delisted, yet our constituents are being asked to pay billions of dollars each year in both direct and indirect costs to subsidize failed species conservation actions. Worst of all, the ESA's implementation desensitizes private landowners who are working hard to benefit species conservation, like my constituent, Sean Vibert, who grows wildflowers that create habitat for monarch butterflies. For example, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service estimates that recovering the Oregon spotted frog, the species affecting Mr. Vibert's operation, will cost $2.8 billion. That's the estimate. I will say again, $2.8 billion for one species. How useful is a recovery plan when the odds of it being implemented at that cost are so slim? The issue before us today is not whether these species should be protected. The issue is, are the management decisions made by these services the right ones, and are the costs associated with these decisions worth it, both for the species conservation and the costs imposed on our constituents? Take the case of the northern spotted owl in Oregon, where studies have shown the listing of the owl and its 9.6 million acres of associated critical habitat have cost the loss of 32,000 timber jobs. The costs we are examining today, as indicated previously, are not just to businesses, but also the cost to our constituents and other species. The status quo is not good enough, nor is it sustainable. I am certain we will hear today that there's nothing to see here, and that even to raise these issues is to attack species. I assure you, questioning what we're having to pay and who's having to pay it for such modest benefit in recovered species is exactly what my constituents want me to do, and I believe this hearing will go a long way in addressing this concern. With that, Mr. Huffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon, everyone. Happy 50th anniversary to the Endangered Species Act for those who celebrate. I think we should be celebrating the ESA. This is a historic and popular conservation law which has prevented countless species from going extinct. It's also enabled the recovery of some iconic species like the bald eagle and the humpback whale. But so far this year, my Republican colleagues have been much more interested in using the platform of this committee to villainize, attack, and misinform people about the ESA. It's almost hard to believe that 50 years ago, this landmark legislation was spearheaded by Republican environmental champions. Today, Republican environmentalists are the most critically endangered species in politics. And you don't have to take my word for it. You can just look at what happened last week. There was a Republican amendment that they tried to pass to the NDAA involving the ESA. The Department of Defense didn't ask for it, didn't need it, didn't want it. But all but two Republican members of the House Natural Resources Committee voted to categorically exclude the Department of Defense and all of their defense contractors from the Endangered Species Act without so much as having a hearing on the radical language that would have gutted a big part of the ESA. Thankfully, it failed. But the consequences of what Team Extreme tried to do last week to the ESA are staggering. There are 400 ESA-listed species on military lands. There are 60 species found only on military lands. Exempting DoD could push dozens of endangered species toward extinction. And fortunately for those species, 25 Republicans joined Democrats in defeating that terrible amendment. But all but two Republicans on this committee, including Chair Westerman and Chair Benz, voted for it. And now we hear about a new House GOP working group to modernize the Endangered Species Act. Talk about euphemisms. Look at how they vote. That's what they want to do. And today, Team Extreme is at it again. We can expect to hear the usual anti-ESA tropes in this hearing, like how threatened and endangered species, not climate change, are responsible for wildfires and drought in the West. We'll also hear how the ESA is Hotel California, where species check in but never leave, never get off the list. If you want to find an actual problem with the Endangered Species Act, we should be talking about listing, not delisting. Because the fact is, political opposition to listing and the lack of agency resources for listing means that species are often listed too late in the game, when their population has declined so much that they have to remain on the endangered or threatened list because they face such an uphill battle to recovery. We'll also hear tales today, tall tales, about how the ESA stops vital projects from moving forward. We've got to look at the facts, folks, not the rhetoric. The reality is, according to a scientific review of over 88,000 ESA consultations over 7 years, 0 projects were stopped and 0 projects were extensively altered as a result of jeopardy or adverse modification findings. So when you look past all the fake narratives and anti-ESA rhetoric, you discover ESA is actually sensible. It's quite flexible and it's reasonable. Meanwhile, we have a biodiversity crisis. Too many species are on the brink of extinction. We don't have time for for the Republican majority to hold hearings that scapegoat imperiled species and pretend like climate change doesn't exist. These species are going extinct. 3 of them go extinct every hour. By the end of our opening statements, we'll have 10 minutes until another species is driven to extinction. Now, the ESA has kept 99% of listed species from going extinct. It is our strongest backstop against extinction for myriad species. And the simple truth is that extreme MAGA Republicans want to dismantle it. The only hearings they've held in this Congress have been about weakening and eliminating ESA protections, including delistings, before a science-based decision can even be made. And last week, of course, they tried to write a huge part of the U.S. economy out of the Endangered Species Act categorically. This landmark law has given us a shining example of species recovery. If we funded it right and supported collaborative efforts, we could prevent a lot of biodiversity loss. Imagine if we prioritized wildlife and habitat as much as we prioritize subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. Last year, the United States offered over $22 billion in subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. If we put half that much into ESA implementation, into protection of wildlife and critical habitat, imagine the kind of world that we could have, and imagine fights and political theater like this that could be avoided. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I now recognize the full Natural Resources Committee Chairman, Mr. Westerman, for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Chairman Bentz, for holding this hearing, and thank you, Ranking Member Huffman, for your much anticipated opening remarks, which I was expecting to hear most of those things that you said. And I would ask the question, what is so radical about taking a fresh look at a law that's 50 years old, that was put in place by Republicans and championed by Republicans, and you're looking at a Republican that doesn't want to do away with the ESA, wants to make the ESA work, wants to make it something that's effective, that really is about helping species, helping biodiversity, and improving it. And as a forester, I can tell you one of the biggest things we could do would be to work on healthy habitat that promotes great biodiversity, that promotes the welfare of endangered species. And it's really the only thing we can do. You know, we've got a bill that Representative Dingell, who just stepped out, will be working on. The Democrat version is Recovering America's Wildlife Act. We're going to call our version Restoring America's Wildlife Habitat Act, because when it comes to wildlife, really the only thing you can do is restore the habitat. And we're seeing thousands, if not millions of acres of habitat on federal lands that's being mismanaged, that's being destroyed by catastrophic wildfire, that's being destroyed by insects and disease. And if we really cared about endangered species, we would truly care about the forest habitat, the water habitat, the wetlands, and the ecosystems that promote good habitat and species recovery. And I think it's fair that we look back on a bill that's 50 years old. We celebrate the victories of it. We have a strong population of bald eagles. We have grizzly bears. We have wolves that should be off the Endangered Species Act. That's not me saying that. That's the Obama administration and other administrations that tried to delist the wolf, but they're still on the list. So I think it's our responsibility as stewards of the American taxpayers' dollar, as stewards of policy, to take a fresh look at the ESA. And let's go back and look at the purpose of the ESA. And I quote, when it was established, the purpose of this act are to provide a means whereby the ecosystems upon which endangered species and threatened species depend may be conserved. It didn't say preserved, it said conserved, and that's a valid point. To provide a program for the conservation of such endangered species and threatened species, and to take such steps as may be appropriate to achieve the purposes of the treaties and conventions set forth, end quote. You know, unfortunately, litigants now use the ESA as a control tactic to preserve lands, or try to preserve lands, and pursue radical agendas. You know, I heard the word radical and extreme. Well, there's not anything much more radical than extreme than to take well-meaning laws and misuse them and misapply them that are actually defeating the purpose of the law in the first place. Instead, we should be pursuing a noble conservation mission. And today's hearing is about examining the cost associated with ESA. And I don't want to make it just about the financial cost, but it's also the cost when we lose species, when we tie up resources inside our federal agencies that could be used in going towards actually helping endangered species, but they're tied up in the regulatory and the litigation process and not able to do the work and the jobs that many of them, went to college and made their career path to go out and help with endangered species. For these and many other reasons, the House Committee on Natural Resources Republicans, and I would invite any Democrat that wants to join, we're partnering with the Congressional Western Caucus and Chairman Dan Newhouse to lead a working group of members from across the country that will engage with local communities that are most impacted by the ESA and develop policy proposals to modernize and renew the ESA for the 21st century. And again, I would hope this would be a bipartisan effort. It's not because we haven't made this open to our friends across the aisle. It's because they don't want to be part of the group. This work is absolutely necessary for the future of species conservation and our constituents because the status quo just isn't good enough anymore. Again, I want to thank Chairman Bentz and thank our witnesses for being here today. I look forward to asking questions of our witnesses after hearing their testimony, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I now recognize the full Natural Resources Committee's ranking member, Mr. Gahalva, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the ranking member. Today, as the ranking member noted, some of us are celebrating 50 years of the Endangered Species Act. Others are trying to gut it. And the Endangered Species Act is supported by over 90% of the American people. So you would think our committee could come together with the shared goal of recovering and conserving our shared wildlife heritage for current and future generations. Just like Congress did 50 years ago for the original ESA, with our late friend, John Dingell, leading the efforts in this House of Representatives. 50 years ago, when the Endangered Species Act was enacted, we knew far less about our country's biodiversity. Most people were unaware of how quickly our climate would change from the burning of fossil fuels, but the ESA was ahead of its time. Today, we are grappling with the consequences of our own actions. We are now facing unprecedented rates of global warming, habitat destruction, and degradation, and our world's at the risk of losing 1 million species. Today, we ask our colleagues across the aisle what modernization of the ESA looks like. They don't have good answers. I think we should focus on the goal of recovery. We are still behind in developing recovery plans, and many species get less than 1,000 per year for recovery efforts. We've drafted the Extinction Prevention Act to provide funding for some of those underfunded, most imperiled species. And last year, House Democrats secured $125 million for species recovery in the Inflation Reduction Act. Not one Republican voted for the bill, although they've been taking credit for the projects lately. Instead of wringing our hands or chipping away at ESA's protections and then complaining about that it's not working, Congress should do more of what it did in the IRA. We should invest significantly in species conservation, set our visionary wildlife conservation laws, and use the ESA as an example of success. And with that, Madam Chair, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I'll now introduce our witnesses. Ms. Janet Coit, Deputy Administrator for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in Washington, D.C. The Honorable Martha Williams, Director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Washington, D.C. Mr. Jonathan Wood, Vice President of Law and Policy at the Property and Environment Research Center in Bozeman, Montana. Mr. Daniel Ash, CEO of the Association of Zoos and Aquariums in Silver Spring, Maryland. Mr. Justin Johns, CEO of East Central Energy in Brom, Minnesota. And Mr. Sean Vibert, owner of the Obsidian Seed Company in Madras, Oregon. Let me remind the witnesses that under committee rules, you must limit your oral statements to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will appear in the hearing record. To begin your testimony, please press the talk button on the microphone. We use timing lights. When you begin, the light will turn green. When you have 1 minute remaining, the light will turn yellow, and at the end of 5 minutes, the light will turn red, and I will ask you to please complete your statement. I will also allow all witnesses to testify before member questioning. I now recognize Deputy Administrator Coit for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon. Subcommittee Chair Benz, Ranking Member Huffman, Full Chair Committee Westerman, and Ranking Member Grijalva, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Janet Coit, and I am the Assistant Administrator for NOAA Fisheries. Throughout my career, the Endangered Species Act, or ESA, has been a common thread. In the mid-1990s, I was counsel to the U.S. Committee on Environment and Public Works, working for the late, great Senator John Chafee, where I focused on reauthorization of the ESA. My work is coming full circle, as I'm now the head of NOAA Fisheries, one of the agencies responsible for implementing ESA. The Endangered Species Act is one of the foundational laws that underpins the critically important work that NOAA Fisheries does to recover marine and anadromous species while supporting economic and recreational opportunities. As you noted, this year marks ESA's 50th anniversary, and the law's purpose and goals remain as relevant today as they were in 1973. The ESA has been remarkably successful in preventing the extinction of 99% of the species listed under the Act, recovering some of America's most iconic species and putting many on the road to recovery. By promoting conservation of habitats and preventing the loss of biodiversity, the ESA has provided myriad benefits across the nation and beyond. Over the past 50 years, the ESA has led to innovation and conservation to support species and the habitats on which they depend. NOAA Fisheries is committed to evolving in response to stakeholder and species needs to implement ESA more effectively and efficiently. Importantly, we continue to make improvements to the way we analyze and implement the law, especially to ensure that we're meeting current challenges, such as how the impacts of climate change affect species and habitats. Climate change poses an ever-increasing threat to native biodiversity and is accelerating the extinction crisis. Scientists estimate that as many as 1 million species are in danger of extinction, many within decades. We must continue to expand our scientific understanding and bring focused attention and investments in order to protect and recover listed species and their habitats before it's too late. No one wants to see marine mammals, fish, sea turtles, corals, or other creatures go extinct, not on our watch. To that end, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act are providing historic levels of funding towards state, tribal, and local efforts to conserve habitats that support listed species. With new funding under these laws, NOAA is able to catalyze habitat restoration projects that conserve fisheries and protected species, while also strengthening the resilience of coastal ecosystems and communities. Sustained investments like these are critical to ensure the future of diverse and productive ecosystems. I've been fortunate over the past couple years to witness firsthand some of the work of our NOAA scientists and fishery managers. While in California last year, I visited our Southwest Fisheries Science Center, where NOAA scientists and partners are studying endangered white abalone. In 2019, captive-bred juvenile white abalone were released for the first time into coastal waters off Northern California. Similar efforts are underway in Florida, where they're looking at ways to breed and outplant more resilient coral species. Last year, I visited our partners at Mote Marine Laboratory, where scientists are exploring options to scale up recovery efforts for critically endangered corals, some of our most productive ecosystems throughout Florida and the Caribbean. And we're seeing endangered marine mammals like the Hawaiian monk seal begin to rebound. A recent population assessment shows a 2% increase annually since 2013, reversing at least 6 decades of steep population decline. While we're acknowledging 50 years of successes, there is much more work to do. Climate change and other human and environmental impacts continue to threaten protected species and make recovery even more challenging. When I look ahead at the next 50 years, I envision new science, technological advances, and stronger partnerships aimed at conserving listed species and the network of habitats needed to preserve biodiversity. The ESA will continue to provide a critical safety net to our nation's fish and wildlife for years to come. But to ensure success, we must both work together with states, tribes, and a broad array of partners, and provide sufficient resources now and into the future. I'm proud of the work NOAA Fisheries has done over the last 50 years to uphold the Endangered Species Act and to put listed species on the road to recovery. I look forward to working with you and others to chart a successful route through the challenges ahead. I know we all feel a sense of urgency and responsibility, and I'm happy to be here and would be pleased to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Assistant Administrator Coit. I now recognize Director Williams for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Bentz, Ranking Member Huffman, full committee chair Westerman, and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today. We need the Endangered Species Act now more than ever. Unprecedented and prolonged heat in the Southwest, ocean temperatures in the 90s off of Florida, flooding and extreme weather in places not used to it, like Vermont, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire. Drought, the likes of which we have not seen before in the West. Wildfires raging in Canada, sending unhealthy air into much of our country. These are bad for people, but they are even worse for populations of wildlife, fish, and plants that have adapted over millennia to certain ecosystems. Climate stressors, degraded and fragmented habitats, invasive species, and disease are pushing to the brink of collapse some of the very symbols that set us apart as a nation, our rich diversity of wildlife, fish, and plants. And yet, I have hope for the future. I am hopeful because where you give nature a chance, it has a remarkable ability to heal. Thanks to the Endangered Species Act, sea turtles return 23 years or more after they hatch, coming in off of the ocean by moonlight to lay over 100 eggs and return to the sea that same night. After over 100 years of absence, salmon can spawn in a stream after removing a barrier to their return. Wood ducks can thrive because we work together to plant rice. A child can still see the wonder of a firefly, and cow elk can chatter to each other on a cold winter morning. I am hopeful because each of us as we are exposed to these examples, we can't help but be in awe of nature. At our very core, Americans care about the ecosystems that serve as resilience and buffer against storms, that help keep our water clean, that provide our food and the pollinators that are key to its production. I am hopeful because when we are down, when we need it most, we turn to nature, as in the pandemic when so many reconnected with the outside world. I am hopeful because of the many partnerships catalyzed by the Endangered Species Act, even those centered around the species that are so controversial. Without the Endangered Species Act, I wouldn't have this hope. 50 years ago, in 1973, a nearly unanimous Congress passed this incredibly consequential bipartisan act, which President Nixon signed into law. The Endangered Species Act was a response to a groundswell of public concern over the steady and precipitous decline of wildlife and habitat. Unregulated market hunting wiped out the passenger pigeon, a species that once numbered in the billions. Other species nearly faced similar fates. Southern sea otters were hunted to near extinction during the fur trade. Bison were decimated, and many populations of migratory birds were drastically reduced, killed for their feathers. Raptors like the peregrine falcon and our nation's symbol, the bald eagle, came close to extinction due to toxins in the environment. Congress enacted the Endangered Species Act because when we lose a species, we become poorer as a country. The law states the policy of Congress that all federal departments and agencies seek to conserve listed species and use their authorities to further the purposes of the ESA. It does not grant discretion to give up on a species and allow it to blink out. The ESA serves as an emergency room for America's fish, wildlife, and plants. It stems extinctions. Almost all of the species protected by the ESA are still with us today. The ESA, too, stabilizes hundreds of species in decline. We all seek to move species from the emergency room to full recovery. Some require more effort and tools to get there. Federal agencies and project proponents engage in thousands of consultations each year to ensure that their actions won't jeopardize a species' existence. Through the combination of incentives and regulation, the ESA serves as a powerful catalyst to collectively bring all that we can to protect and conserve and move species through the continuum of recovery. It encourages partnerships between federal government, state, tribal, and local governments, private landowners, conservation organizations, and other interested parties. It provides flexibility for partners to work on voluntary conservation agreements, and we recognize that those partnerships are critical to the long-term conservation of our species. Moreover, federal agencies and our partners are continually evolving and improving how we implement this law for people and for the species. No doubt this immense investment of effort, collaboration, and dedication underpins the Endangered Species Act. This work is done day in and day out, year after year, and is essential for conserving our natural heritage for the future. I look forward to working with this committee, and I'm here to answer any questions you may have. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Wood for 5 minutes.
Chairman Benz, Ranking Member Huffman, thank you for inviting me to participate in this important and timely discussion of the Endangered Species Act on its 50th anniversary. Living in Bozeman, Montana, I have the great fortune of living next to one of the nation's largest intact ecosystems, an ecosystem that supports grizzly bears, gray wolves, and countless other cherished wildlife. But living in Montana means I also get to see firsthand how well-intentioned federal policies can sometimes go awry and produce conflict where what we're aiming for was conservation. Too often, the ESA has been an example of such a policy. It's true that over the last 50 years, only 1% of listed species have gone extinct. That is a critically important accomplishment that we should all celebrate and that we should make sure that we don't lose. However, in passing the ESA, Congress set more ambitious goals to recover to the species to the point that they were no longer at risk, and it's that goal on which we're falling short. As you've heard today, only 3% of listed species have recovered to date. In fact, PERC's research has shown that of the 300 species the service predicted to recover by 2023, only 13 have. We can and must do better. The lack of recoveries reflects a fundamental problem in the implementation of the ESA. Incentives matter, and too often we've gotten the incentives wrong. Regulations penalize landowners who conserve rare species and their habitats, alienating vital partners. Instead, we must encourage states, tribes, and private landowners to invest in habitat restoration and other proactive recovery efforts. To the Biden administration's credit, it has recognized the critical importance that incentives play in conservation and committed to pursue conservation in ways that, quote, honor private property rights and support voluntary stewardship. Today, I'll discuss some ways that the ESA can be better implemented to align with this vision of conservation as something, quote, done with private landowners, not to them. First, regulations for threatened species should be more creatively used to encourage proactive recovery efforts. In my written testimony, I discuss how those regulations could chart roadmaps to recover species like the grizzly bear, giving legal effect to the recovery goals identified in recovery plans, allowing states to resume management authority gradually as those goals are met, and rewarding incremental progress toward a species recovery. This approach could avoid tremendous conflict in the resources it wastes. But using that approach means rejecting the proposal to restore a failed and illegal policy of regulating threatened species as if they were endangered. The administration's own actions demonstrate that that proposal would be a step backwards for species. Every time the service has listed an animal during this administration and considered what was the best approach to recover that species, it has rejected endangered level regulations. Again, every single time. And yet the current proposal is to automatically treat threatened species if they're endangered without considering what's best for those species. The other critical opportunity is to find ways to encourage habitat maintenance and restoration. Many of these habitats will not exist if we simply leave them alone. We have to encourage proactive activity to maintain and restore them. States and private conservation organizations have pioneered many tools for achieving this purpose, including things like habitat leases, but those are underused in the context of the ESA. Critical habitat designations, on the other hand, can't motivate that kind of proactive engagement in conservation. At best, they can conserve existing features on lands where those features could not be changed without a federal permit. Critical habitat designations are especially unhelpful on private lands that are currently unoccupied or unsustainable or unsuitable for a species. In the Weyerhaeuser case, for instance, there was no reason to think that an unwanted designation that lowered the value of private land would encourage a private landowner to convert their land into habitat for the dusky gopher frog. That is really difficult work, and you don't get there by alienating a landowner. In the wake of that Supreme Court defeat, the service's refusal to follow a consistent definition of habitat or to address incentives in its designations only exacerbates conflict at the expense of conservation. I'll conclude on the issue that we should hope to be the conclusion for every listed species, delisting. A prompt and efficient delisting process is essential to reward states, tribes, and private landowners for their role in recovering species. It is noteworthy that despite all the conflict around delistings, there has not yet been a single species that has recovered, been transferred to state management, and backslid into back on the list. Every time states have taken control of species, they've managed to sustain those recoveries. Litigation, encouraged by overly generous attorney's fees, has been a significant obstacle to the service's ability to delist species and take other critical steps to recover species. It is often said that you get what you pay for, so perhaps it shouldn't be a surprise that heavily subsidizing disruptive litigation, while penalizing landowners' voluntary habitat restoration, has produced too much of the former and far too little of the latter. If the ESA is going to recover more species in its second half-century than it did in its first, it is essential that it be implemented in ways that get the incentives right. Species must be an asset for the private landowners to provide habitat and undertake recovery efforts rather than continuing to be a liability. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Ash for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and committee members. It's a pleasure and an honor to testify before you on the Endangered Species Act. I'm the president and CEO of the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, and our vision is that a modern accredited aquarium or zoo is a wildlife conservation organization. Our membership of 253 facilities in 13 countries lives this vision every day. They have played leading roles in some of the ESA's most celebrated successes, like the inspiring rescue and recovery of the California condor. They collectively contribute over $250 million annually in direct support for wildlife conservation. Their education programs annually reach more than 360 million people. AZA accredited members support the notion of a strong and protective legal framework for endangered and threatened species. They're enthusiastic partners in saving species from extinction and also frustrated and disappointed regulated parties. Unfortunately, as we approach the ESA's 50th anniversary, its once rock-solid political support has significantly eroded. And the timing couldn't be worse when it is facing challenges not envisioned when it was enacted or even when it was last reauthorized in 1992, namely the planet's sixth mass extinction, fueled by demands of a growing and increasingly affluent human population and accelerated by climate change, exotic and invasive species, the explosion of illegal trade and wildlife trafficking. We cannot stop extinction, but through effective implementation of laws like the ESA, we can save many species. Like these inspiring examples in which AZA accredited members have played instrumental roles, the heroic rescue and rehabilitation of dozens of endangered manatees and thousands of endangered sea turtles every year, Oregon Zoo's innovations in facility design and husbandry that are facilitating groundbreaking research on captive polar bears, an exciting new partnership between Cincinnati Zoo, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and private landowners in Texas to use captive-bred ocelots to restore genetic diversity into the dwindling wild population of ocelots. San Diego Zoo's Frozen Zoo, with over 10,000 cryopreserved living cell lines representing over 1,000 taxa and a seed bank with 65 million samples, the largest and most diverse collection of its kind in the world. The Florida Reef Track Rescue Project, an AZA partnership with the state of Florida and NOAA Fisheries that has collected thousands of corals at 19 facilities in 12 states and creating the potential for future restoration and recovery. Despite being long-standing and trusted conservation partners, our members are increasingly frustrated by long delays in the permit application process. In our view, this is not the result of infirmities in the law, but the result of completely inadequate funding and staffing to handle their permitting workloads. Wildlife Encounters in Winter Haven, Florida has been in a 3-year, still unsuccessful struggle for approval to move captive bred macaws to support a Bolivian government rewilding project. Cincinnati Zoo's application to import captive Asian elephants from a European zoo is still pending after 18 months. Smithsonian National Zoo has waited nearly a year for an export permit to return pandas to China as required by their lease agreement with China. Alaska Sea Life Center waited 40 years for renewal of its permit to rehabilitate rescued walruses, an essential government service that they provide at their own cost. AZA members are proud to support ESA successes through captive breeding for reintroduction, rescue of endangered species, and care of confiscated wildlife. However, their experience with delays in permitting is frustrating, disruptive of conservation efforts, and deleterious to animal care and well-being. Our members support the ESA. They do not object to the need for compliance, but the delays in achieving compliance are unacceptable. A strong and effective Endangered Species Act has never been more relevant and important, and most important, in our view, is the need to adequately resource the agencies charged with its implementation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Nash. I now recognize Mr. Johns for 5 minutes.
Chairman Benz, Ranking Member Huffman, and members of the subcommittee, my name is Justin Johns. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of East Central Energy, headquartered in Bram, Minnesota. ECE is a not-for-profit rural electric cooperative that serves nearly 66,000 member consumers. ECE manages over 8,000 miles of distribution lines, which includes rights-of-ways and acreage around substations. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today and offer a perspective on how the Endangered Species Act affects the ability of electric cooperatives to provide affordable and reliable power. ECE is one of about 900 electric cooperatives nationwide, providing electricity to approximately 42 million Americans in 48 states. Electric cooperatives are guided by 7 principles, including an inherent concern for community. We live in the communities we serve and we care about the environment. We support the underlying goals of the ESA. However, we think it is important to highlight how even a well-intentioned law can create real-world challenges. The 50th anniversary of the ESA provides a great opportunity to discuss ways to improve the Act so it works better for both species and communities, a goal I think we can all agree on. I have seen the value of voluntary conservation measures and how they can benefit species like the monarch butterfly. In my experience, the best way to preserve the struggling monarch butterfly is through voluntary conservation efforts rather than government regulation. In the early 2000s, East Central Energy began developing a utility vegetation management plan that had a heavy emphasis on ecosystem and ecology. We knew intuitively that creating an ecosystem of compatible plants would provide many benefits to our environment. In 2018, Alicia Kroll, an ECE employee, came to the Environmental Committee and proposed the idea of a monarch way station project on ECE property. Eventually, the decision was made by our executive team and the board of directors to set aside 2 2-acre plots for pollinator habitat creation. Around this time, an innovative, multi-state, multi-industry candidate conservation agreement with assurances for the monarch butterfly was being promoted within the rights-of-way as Habitat Working Group at the University of Illinois, Chicago. As we explored this opportunity more, we learned that the CCAA was a roadmap for energy and transportation land managers to reduce or potentially remove key threats to the monarch butterfly that occur on our rights-of-way. ECE was the first rural electric cooperative in the nation to receive a certificate of inclusion into the monarch CCAA. Today, the habitat at our headquarters is in its 4th full growing season and is now well established and beautiful, I might add. This year, the remaining portion of land immediately adjacent to the current habitat will be converted back to native plants as well. As part of the enrollment in the CCAA, annual monitoring occurs. The target for the Midwest region is 6 stems of milkweed per acre and 10% cover of nectar plants. In 2022, ECE averaged 556 stems of milkweed per acre and 21% nectar cover in its rights-of-way. ECE's success is due to our 2+ decade commitment to performing voluntary integrated vegetation management. Many other co-ops are currently working to implement similar strategies. Listing the monarch and associated critical habitat designations could derail these important efforts. Now, the costs associated with protecting these species can vary greatly. Each additional cost that co-ops incur when complying with species listing is felt directly by our members because electric cooperatives operate at cost. Keeping our rates as affordable as possible is important because co-ops serve 92% of this country's persistent poverty counties. ECE has been fortunate that our voluntary compliance costs have been manageable. We have been able to adapt many of our standard practices to benefit the monarch. However, any changes to daily operations if the monarch is listed under the ESA could significantly increase cost to those unprotected by an agreement like the CCAA, especially if their vegetation management programs need to change. Additionally, there could be uncertainty if any critical habitat is assigned with the listing. We can do better. Electric cooperatives support the underlying goals of the ESA, and we think it can be improved to work better for both endangered and threatened species and the communities where they are found. My written statement includes several recommendations on ways to improve the ESA with a greater focus on species recovery, increased transparency, greater stakeholder engagement, and several other recommendations. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I'd be happy to answer any questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Mr. Johns. I now recognize Mr. Vibert for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Bentz, Ranking Member Huffman, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Sean Vibert, sixth-generation farmer of a 131-year-old farm in Central Oregon. I'm honored to be invited here on the 50th anniversary. I have to admit I'm a little nervous being here, not talking to you guys, but I have never left the farm for a day and a half during harvest. But I feel it's important to do so. I'm in the middle of Kentucky bluegrass harvest, poitriv harvest, and I've delayed 2 days of harvesting 195 acres of blue flax for Utah's conservation efforts. I was here in March, and I have to say I sat in on a hearing here in this very room, and I was very impressed, at the same time very disheartened being in here. I have 3 points to make. First of all, single species management of the ESA, in my view, is misguided. We don't even, the other point is we don't even know if the mitigation efforts in my area for the spotted frog that are underway are effective or even work. And finally, it is sad, but no one species should take precedence over a community, its citizens, or other species. And I guarantee you, I'm on the ground, I've seen the other species that are hurting from what's going on. I'm not here to advocate repeal of the ESA. In fact, I'm far from it. I've worked hard to become the second largest wildflower seed producer in the United States. I produce up to 27 different varieties a year that go into strip mining rehabilitation, fire rehab, sage grouse habitat improvement, the pollinator improvement with the monarch corridor, which emphasizes 2 species, the bumblebee and the monarch butterfly. I guess to say that's my contribution to Team Extreme. The seed companies that I deal with depend on me for 3 of the varieties. I hold basically the corner on the market. Purple coneflower, upright yellow prairie coneflower, and black-eyed Susan. They don't have them, the projects don't get done. I don't have the water, I can't get them planted. It doesn't make any sense that I have a species to the south of me, 75 miles where I get my water through Wickiup Reservoir, that has a stable population to most scientists that have studied it, affecting me trying to do work for a species that's getting ready to go on the list in November. It doesn't make any sense at all. If you look at my written testimony, you will see a little bit about where I draw water from. I won't overwhelm you about it, but I'll basically say this. It's like we have a certain amount of water because we were sued by the Center for Biodiversity to supply, and over the course of the next 3 years, ramp up to 500 CFS, even in the wintertime, for a frog that's underneath the snow and the mud, for habitat. It's not even being used. Water going down the river that's being wasted. And It's like having a bathtub and you can't fill it because the plug's out of it. That's what we're up against. And I don't have the water, nor do my counterparts behind me that came to support me to water their cattle, raise their crops. It's been very costly, and you guys don't understand what it's costing you and us. You have, for those of you that are on the climate bus, the climate change bus, the people behind me had to truck in 30 million tons of feed last year to their farm because they usually raise it on their farm. They couldn't do it because there was no water available to us. We had to save it for the frog. And that taxes infrastructure. Certainly, you know, the carbon emissions. It's been gut-wrenching to live where I live. Just last week at this time, a farmer committed suicide because he didn't have any hope. Now, I don't agree with that, but I'll tell you what, I question when we started pitting species for human life. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll now recognize members for 5 minutes for questions, and we'll begin with Chairman Westerman. Recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Bentz, and thank you again to the witnesses for being here today. A lot of familiar faces. Dr. Williams, in 2013, you co-authored an article with other Obama administration officials, and in that article, you stated that critical habitat designations have, quote, have very little impact from a conservation perspective. I and my colleagues have been encouraged or have been engaged in a bipartisan effort under the CRA to reverse the service's rescission of habitat definition. This definition limits designations to areas that can actually support species, which is in line with the article that you helped author in 2013. So given your views on the limited conservation benefit of critical habitat, it seems that the work the service is doing under your leadership not only contradicts the views expressed in the article, but also alienates landowners and distracts from recovering species. So in that same article, you also noted that making controversial regulatory decisions like critical habitat designations before considering how best to recover species results in missed opportunities to promote recovery, which I agree with that. So what policy reforms are needed for the service to focus on recovery planning first and avoid the, quote, fire, aim, ready problem that you identified in that article?
Chairman Bentz, Chairman Westerman, thank you for that question. First off, I did write that article. I did not write that article in my official capacity, and especially not in my capacity as the director of the Fish and Wildlife Service. I think that critical habitat designation is quite misunderstood, and sometimes we hang our hats on it when really the heart of the endangered species lies elsewhere. Section 4 listing, Section 7 consultations, and the like. To answer your question, I think there are a number of layers to this. Yes, I very much agree with you. We're the Fish and Wildlife Service and our sister agency, not so chronically starved in funding. We could put more into recovery planning. Thanks very much to the Inflation Reduction Act, we are able to now put $62.5 million into recovery planning, and that's very important. But to get to the proposed changes in the critical habitat designation regulation, I don't believe that the last administration's changes were reasoned or moderate, nor were they helpful. What the proposed regulation under this administration does, and I think sometimes it has been mischaracterized, is it finds that very reasoned and steady and the attempt to have a durable solution to critical habitat designation going forward. In fact, when I was the director of the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, I wrote a comment letter in opposition to the previous administration adding a definition of critical habitat into the regulations. So, because I didn't think it helped me then as a state director, it hindered. So just to know that the regulations, this administration, and under my tenure as director of the Fish and Wildlife Service, is meant to be very reasoned and durable and does not change consultations or many of the other issues that people have raised. Nonetheless, I look forward to working with you, Chair Westerman, on these issues that I know you care about very much as well as me.
Thank you. Mr. Wood, what role do private lands and states play in recovering species? And how do the ESA and current regulations make it so that species are a liability to the people who are actually trying to protect them?
Private landowners are the most important conservationists. The Fish and Wildlife Service has found that over 2/3 of species depend on private land for their habitat. And too often, because we lead with regulations rather than recovery planning or on-the-ground conservation efforts, the signal that an ESA listing sends to private landowners is a penalty. That immediately your ability to use your land is restricted by the take prohibition. If your land is designated critical habitat, its value may go down. It is all stick, and it's only later that we start thinking about what the carrot should be to encourage the maintenance and restoration of that habitat.
And we're often told that all we need is more money, just more money to recover species. Why do we need good policy reforms and not just money to make a difference?
Because right now what we're doing is making species and their habitat a liability and then trying to use funding to make up for that. It's sort of like you've dug a hole and then tried to fill it up, when it would be better off to start from a perspective of how do we make species and their habitat an asset at the front end so we're not having to fix that policy error.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Ranking Member Huffman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the witnesses. I want to dig in a little further to this idea of voluntary and incentive-based conservation as an alternative, perhaps. It's been suggested to some of the more prescriptive aspects of the ESA. I think there is this notion that we've heard a few times already today that if we did less of the listing, less of the critical habitat designation, and in fact, we've actually seen some bills to take away those authorities and constrain them, that we could then better support voluntary initiatives. And we've heard some success stories on that type of conservation here today. We love those stories. It's great to see, and thanks for everybody who does that. But Mr. Ash, I want to start with you. Do you think that voluntary conservation efforts alone are going to get us very far down the road with respect to the Endangered Species Act? In other words, if we took away these prescriptive authorities that are the teeth in the Endangered Species Act, what would happen to some of these voluntary efforts that we all want to see?
Thank you, Mr. Huffman. I would start with when we talk about voluntary efforts, and particularly incentive-driven voluntary efforts, I mean, again, I'll get back to my main point, that takes funding. So the most important incentive-based programs are things like Working Lands for Wildlife and efforts like that, where we're in partnership with the Agriculture Department. It takes funding to drive that. But no, if we think about something like the manatee, one of the key ingredients in recovery to date of the manatee has been reduction in boat collisions. That required a regulation to reduce speeds in areas where manatees congregate. If we had relied on voluntary measures, it wouldn't have happened. You have to have enforceable measures to achieve those objectives. And you assume people basically will comply with the law, and they did in Florida. And we worked in partnership with the state of Florida to enforce those speed restrictions. And so, incentive-based and voluntary conservation measures play a significant role in achieving recovery objectives, but there are clearly instances where they don't work and they're not sufficient.
Thank you. Director Williams, does the presence of that backstop, I mean, we would all prefer to avoid more prescriptive things like listings and designations, but take enforcements, things like that. Do those authorities as a backstop have a beneficial effect in terms of motivating voluntary conservation efforts that can help avoid listings?
Thank you for that question, Ranking Member Huffman. I mean, I would echo, in answering that, I would echo Mr. Ash in that voluntary conservation is incredibly important, and it is very much a part of the underpinning of the Endangered Species Act. But the voluntary conservation alone does not get us to where we need to be for so many species. And yes, often when species or candidates are at risk, are declining, there is an incentive to get voluntary conservation agreements in place that provide assurances if that species were to be listed. So yes, I think that the specter of listing can help spur conservation to happen. We'd like to be in the spot of helping species before having to get there.
Similarly, if that backstop did not exist, is it fair to assume that some of these voluntary partnerships might not materialize?
I think that's the case that we have seen over time.
I want to ask about science. Assistant Administrator Coit, it has been suggested in some of our prior hearings in context of several bills we've considered that members of Congress ought to make the call on which species get listed and delisted. And we have a lot of interesting members of Congress. You know, we have dentists and tree experts, and the chairman's a pretty good water lawyer. But we don't have the kind of wildlife science resource capacity that resource agencies actually have. And the ESA was kind of set up to take the politics out of these decisions, wasn't it? Why is it important that we leave these tough decisions to the scientists at these agencies?
Appreciate the question, Ranking Member Huffman. I think a core tenet of ESA is that these decisions on listing should be based solely on the basis of the best scientific and commercial data available, and that is in the purview of the scientific community. And while we ask for input on those decisions, it's essential to the integrity of the ESA that they be made based on science. That's a core principle.
Yield back.
Chair recognizes Representative McClintock for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The ranking member just told us that we're losing 3 species every hour. So let me get this straight. The ESA's recovered 58 species in 50 years at enormous cost, and yet we're losing 3 species every hour. Now, that doesn't sound to me like a very effective program. Fortunately, the claim is simply extreme junk science. Variations of it have circulated around the internet for many years. The BBC, which is hardly a right-wing cable network, thoroughly debunked this claim in 2012. In part, it reported, and I quote, "The International Union for Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, has listed 801 animal and plant species, mostly animal, known to have gone extinct since 1500. And then they asked the question, if it's really true that up to 150 species are being lost every day, shouldn't we expect to be able to name more than 801 extinct species in 512 years? Mr. Chairman, I'd ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the BBC expose entitled Biodiversity Loss, How Accurate Are the Numbers, dated April 25th, 2012. Mr. Bibbert, you said this, and we all agree with it, that no one wants to see a species go extinct if it can be prevented. Why shouldn't captive breeding programs be used to meet ESA requirements? They've been used to bring species like the California condor back from the very brink of extinction. Why can't that same process be used when it's cheaper than the extreme requirements of, for example, setting aside hundreds of thousands or even millions of acres of land and placing it off limit for productive use? I'm told that such a provision, simply allowing captive breeding programs to be used to meet the ESA requirements, would all but solve the pumping restrictions involving the Delta smelt that have desiccated California's Central Valley.
Thank you for the question. Because it's not about the smelt and it's not about the frog. It's about the water. And it's really about power, control. And, you know, my grandfather told me back when I was in high school, he told me he didn't want me to come back to farm. He said, find another job, be a teacher, biologist, do something, don't come back.
Forgive me, but I've only got a few
Okay,
minutes to
so,
ask.
okay,
Wait,
what he said,
Well, let me move to Mr. Wood. Any reason why we shouldn't be able to use captive breeding programs to meet these requirements and maintain these species at healthy levels?
It's not ideal. I think most people would like to see ecosystems conserved, but it absolutely plays a vital role and often can be far more effective than some of the other tools that are used.
Yeah, we're told that somehow they're different, but biologists told me that the difference between a species bred in captivity and one in the wild is the difference between a baby born at a hospital and a baby born at home. Is that accurate?
That's right. In terms of the role they can play in the ecosystem, that you know, if you were to
By the way, I have a bill that would do exactly that. Mr. Chairman, I'd sure like to get a hearing on that bill in the near future. Can I get your commitment to do that? Thank you. Mr. Wood, what can be done to make ESA rulings more transparent? One of the recurrent complaints we hear is that the rules are announced without clear scientific basis or authority, making it difficult, if not impossible, to determine the decision is actually following the facts, or whether the facts are simply being selected to support the decision. Is that a legitimate concern, and if so, what can be done to correct it?
I think so. There is a problem and a lack of consistency across decisions. Different policy judgments we made or different readings of the science will vary from administration to administration, from decision to decision. The repeal of the habitat definition is a good example of this, where the services purported reason to go without a definition to essentially fly blind in the critical habitat space was they wanted the flexibility to decide what habitat might mean from one species to the next, rather than defining the term and following a consistent, clear policy.
One of the great ironies of the ESA is that it often works against the species that it's supposed to protect. A prime example is the spotted owl. Protecting spotted owl habitats put them off limits to forest management. The lack of forest management caused catastrophic buildup of excessive fuels. The wildfires that resulted wiped out the very spotted owl habitats that they were supposed to protect. For example, the Rim Fire in my district in the Sierra Nevada wiped out 46 spotted owl habitats, the King Fire another 32. What would have been a more effective way to protect the spotted owl?
To encourage the maintenance and restoration of the habitat. It's one of the fundamental problems. When the ESA was enacted, the assumption was if we just leave species alone, they'll magically recover, and that's simply not true. We need incentives to encourage people to go out and do the hard work of restoring habitat and pursuing proactive recovery efforts.
Great. Thank you. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Congresswoman Peltola for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'm just sitting over here having an existential crisis. This is not, this is just a really difficult conversation. You know, listening to farmers talk about the lack of water and kind of this Sophie's choice between how do we feed people and make sure that all of the species that we have are being protected as well. But I'm going to get off that topic and ask Assistant Administrator Coit a quick question. So in Alaska, we have ANILCA, Alaska National Lands, I'm awful with this acronym, acronyms, Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act. And this act requires that on federal lands, the top priority be subsistence and the top user group be rural people who live in proximity to that resource when it's in shortage. And I'm wondering, Administrator Coit, how do you balance a law like ANILCA and a law like Endangered Species Act if they're conflicting?
Thank you for that question. As you know, Section 10E of the Endangered Species Act exempts the taking of listed animals for subsistence purposes by Alaska Natives. That helps prevent the conflict that you just referenced.
And it also, if I may, sorry,
Sure.
and it also prevents rural people from, because ANILCA isn't just for natives, it's for rural people, whatever their ethnicity is.
On the general question in terms of statutory requirements, you know, ANILCA, like any other law, is something that we're required to take into account and satisfy And so harmonizing ESA and ANILCA is our responsibility, and I'm not aware of specific conflicts between the two. I can look into that further.
Okay, and I'd like to ask, if I might, Mr. Chairman, the same question of Director Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Congresswoman Peltola. I would, for the Fish and Wildlife Service to get to a specific conflict between the Endangered Species Act and ANILCA, I think is an example that has come up throughout today, is that we'll do our very best to prevent having that direct conflict. And the Fish and Wildlife Service Alaska region has been paying more and more attention to subsistence work and would try to prevent that from even happening, the conflict. So I think the first answer is to not get to that conflict, and for us to be doing our very best to be working with communities and Alaska Natives before getting to that.
Okay, and to Mr., is it Vibert? Vibert.
Yeah.
I guess I'd just like to yield my time to you in the event that you'd like to add anything to this conversation, the larger conversation, not ANILCA, of course.
Yeah, and I'm sorry that I interrupted. I know you had time. But what I was saying, and it would be too easy to do, that has been proposed in my area with the spotted frog, and the Fish and Game they don't want to do that. What it boils down to is the river that I'm near, the Deschutes River, flows high all year long. And it had effect on certain species of fish and wildlife. And, some of the implementation by the scientists, and when I say that loosely as far as experts go, because in my opinion, an expert is a has-been drip under pressure. You can find a scientist who'll believe one way, and I can go, you could find one, vice versa. There's got to come a point here where we all come together and do what is best for the community and the species at hand. I have a notebook on all of you guys. Googled it. And I'll tell you, there's an all-star cast here. And, the disheartening part about it is when I was here, there was some that just didn't ask the people that were actually on the ground what's going on. And it's hurtful. I know you guys wouldn't want to be treated the same way. And we are trying to supply something to you.
Thank you, Chair. Recognizes Congressman Duarte for 5 minutes.
Sure. Thank you, Chairman. It's been an exciting first year as a congressman. We've heard about all kinds of things on the Endangered Species Act in this committee. We've heard about wolves being released into Yellowstone and overpopulating and still not being delisted. We've heard the same thing with grizzly bears. Recently had a major court decision come down in favor of lobstermen who hadn't had a right whale fishing line incident within the last 24 years, but were still required to restrict their practices further because of a claim of Chevron deference by an agency that wanted them to possibly go out of business. I live in the Central Valley. I represent Modesto down through Fresno, where we grow a lot of almonds. We have a lot of irrigated farmland coming out of the Sierra Nevada. A lot of those areas that are irrigated in my district are supplied with water out of the Delta. And we've seen in the last 20, 30 years an incredibly unsuccessful effort to save the Delta smelt. It's dead. It's been dead for a few years. Find me one if you can. To save the salmon. Their numbers are low. They're very low. We're flushing 70 to 90 million acre-feet of water a year out into the ocean from our water projects in California. We've devastated our groundwater. It's fallen dramatically. It's actually caused us infrastructure problems with the subsidence related. It's devastated rural communities, farm families. It's devastated farm workers. And again, provided no benefits. Are you Administrator Coit or Director Williams, are you accountable to deliver results, or are you simply charged to disperse of our resources as you will, without accountability for results? That's a question.
Chairman Benz and Congressman Duarte, as public servants, as a public servant, I believe that for the Fish and Wildlife Service, the buck does stop with me, and I am accountable. But at the same time, to measure the success of endangered species purely on delisting is, I don't think is fully accurate with the purposes for which the act was.
Great. I'll move on to
Congress
Ms.
enacted
Coit,
it.
because I've got a lot more I'd like to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you. I agree with what Director Williams said. I do care deeply about the persistence of the lobster industry and working closely with them. And yes, we're responsible to uphold the law, implement the law, and to ensure that we have our results when it comes to these species that have a multitude of challenges and are on the brink of extinction often by the time they're listed.
Thank you. So here's the last time the Endangered Species Act was reauthorized, right here. And that was about, what, 40 million acres or 30 million acres of critical habitat. And since it failed to be reauthorized, then expired, we've got 250 million acres of critical habitat. Now, a good chunk of that, I know, is the 10% of California's land area that is designated to fairy shrimp critical habitat, fairy shrimp and vernal pool critical habitat. Now, when we talk about fairy shrimp, we're talking about sea monkeys, literally, back in the comic books, at least when I was a kid. These have survived unevolved since 300 million years ago, when the entire surface land area of the globe was one continent, Pangaea. I don't believe that we could absent the earth of fairy shrimp species if we tried, but nonetheless in California, 10% of the land area of California, including great swaths of private farmland, are designated fairy shrimp critical habitat. Now, Fish and Wildlife says, what is critical habitat? This is a document I can provide. Critical habitat is the specific areas within geographic areas occupied by the species that can contain physical or biological features. Critical habitat going forward, designations affect only federal agency actions or federally funded or permitted activities. Critical habitat designations do not affect activities by private landowners if there is no federal nexus, that is, no federal funding or authorization. Is that true today? Are private landowners burdened with critical habitat designations today?
Chairman Benz and Congressman Duarte, in fact, it is true that the provisions of Section 7 for critical habitat apply to the nexus of federal land ownership, or if there's any funding or grant making through that federal agency.
Thank you.
Chair recognizes Representative Dingle for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have a moral obligation to be good stewards of our nation's rich wildlife and ensure we can share these iconic species with generations of Americans to come. Protecting America's wildlife is something that is deeply important to me, and quite frankly, something my late husband, John Dingle, took to heart. He was an avid outdoorsman, angler, and hunter, with a deep appreciation of our country's natural resources, and strengthening our nation's conservation and environmental policies was a core value to him. In fact, as all of you know here, he was the lead author of the Endangered Species Act that was enacted 50 years ago. 10 years ago, on the Endangered Species Act's 40th anniversary, he warned of the dangers of partisan bickering and political agendas in undermining the survival of the ESA. And unfortunately, today's hearing is kind of an example of that. Contrary to this hearing's title, the ESA has really been successful in preventing the extinction of at-risk species. According to the Center for Biological Diversity, The ESA is credited with saving 99% of the species it protects from extinction. At a time when our nation is facing the compounding effects of climate change, habitat loss, pollution, and species overexploitation that all threaten the viability of many species of wildlife and plants, we need to redouble our conservation efforts, not undermine them. I really am concerned about the recent attacks on the ESA that were seen in the Congress, from attempts to congressionally delist imperiled species to attempts to hinder federal agencies' ability to protect species from extinction. And wildlife is paying a toll. A report has recently found that 49% of the bird species worldwide have declining populations. And one of the men said to me, butterflies are sissy things. Well, I don't think the monarch butterfly is, and we've seen it 85% in 2 decades. This should alarm all of us, but only represents a small fraction of the number of species in decline. So, Mr. Ash, I'm going to ask you a few questions. Today, there are over 1,600 domestic species listed as threatened or endangered under the ESA, yet we only hear about a handful of them. Why do only certain species in decline garner such emotional responses that lead to conflicts on the merits of ESA?
Well, my experience, Congresswoman Dingell, is the conflict and the notoriety, the species that generate the most conflict and the most notoriety are the ones where we wait till the last minute to really seriously address their conservation needs. And so we've heard a lot of discussion about proactive conservation measures, and I think that's really important, and certainly what reflected in the work that has been done on the greater sage grouse to try to get ahead of the species before it needs the protection of the Endangered Species Act. And so the species, I think, that get the most notoriety, generate the most conflict, are the ones that are in the most trouble, and where you have the least flexibility in protecting and conserving them.
So, if I understand you correctly, we know that over 99% of species under the ESA have not gone extinct, but when a species is caught too late, there are too few left to rebuild the species and limited options left for recovery. So, Mr. Ash, why are imperiled species like this in such bad shape?
Imperiled species like?
The 1%, the ones that we all fight about.
Again, mostly in my experience, those are species that are habitat-limited species. And we've heard, again, discussion about water. Water is habitat for something like the Delta smelt. And when its availability is limited, those are difficult issues to deal with. I worry about the polar bear, for instance. There are actually a lot of polar bears in the world today, over 20,000, but their habitat is going away. And we have no way to create sea ice habitat. And so it's those species where habitat is the limiting factor that are the most difficult ones to deal with.
I'm going to be out of time, Mr. Chair, but I do want to say I think ESA has been a critical tool, but I think it's important to recognize how we can further strengthen by doing some things ahead of time, like RAWA, which I want to work with all of my colleagues on before at-risk species need to be listed. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Chair recognizes Congressman Lamalfa for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Vibert, when you talk about the 500 CFS that's required to, what stream, what river was that? I'm sorry, I didn't get you.
Say that again.
The 500 CFS that's required year-round, you were
That's,
saying?
right now, under our HCP, we are ramping up to eventually what will be 500 CFS over a course of I think it's over the next 3 years.
And
by year 3, we're at 100 right now during the winter.
Okay. What river is this on?
This is on the Deschutes River.
Okay.
The upper Little Deschutes.
Now,
Yes.
is there a dam on that above?
The reservoirs. There's Crane Prairie, which has now been set aside strictly for spotted frog nursery, and then Wickiup below that. And then it flows into the bend area before it passes through to me down in the lower Deschutes.
So the water running down the river is not being stored, so are those reservoirs getting full?
No.
They don't fill anymore?
No, and we will never fill again, because if you do the numbers, if you look at my written testimony, I believe by year 5, we have, the frog will be allotted 187,000 acre feet, and our reservoir holds 200,000. So anybody with a cork brain and a glass eye could tell you it's not going to work.
We have similar on the Klamath and on the
Yes.
Trinity, too.
Yes, I know.
Yep.
I feel for you.
The farmers I feel for there, as well as the generation of electricity. In the Weyerhaeuser versus Fish and Wildlife case a while back here, it was, the court had ruled that Fish and Wildlife and NIMS may withhold from designating areas as critical habitat if the economic impacts outweigh the benefit to the species. So run with that a little bit. Okay, I need to shift gears here. On FEMA flooding lead up, we've got a dire housing shortage in California. So for Administrator Coit and Director Williams, permitting has already been required to go through extensive ESA procedure in California. Is there anything you can see there's no longer the ability to utilize the letters that are supposed to allow development to go forward in the interim? Do you see anything, Administrator or Director, that is going to allow those agencies to signal that FEMA can proceed with her letter reviews while the agencies investigate the program? So would you consider something similar to a compliance agreement while FEMA works with NOAA and Fish and Wildlife to figure out if there's an actual adverse impact?
This is Janet Coit. I'll start with the answer there. I know that's an issue of concern. I appreciate you raising it. As you note, FEMA is the action agency and the party with whom we are consulting on that. I do not have a specific answer for the question you just posed about the compliance agreements, but I'm aware of
Is that something you can work with us on a little bit?
I will look into it and get back to you directly on that.
Thank you. Director Williams, anything on that?
Congressman Lamalfa, I'm very happy to work with you on that, but I believe really that NOAA has been the lead agency there. I'm happy to work with you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Wood's testimony, you referenced a PERC study. It says the recovery rate for species that the Fish and Wildlife has predicted recover is about 4%. I'm not sure where 99% was coming from earlier. Is this an accurate percentage for the recovery of species your agency believed would recover?
Yes, what that gets at is the species, the service predicted time wouldn't be the constraint, that they predicted would recover by 2023, and our success at recovering those species is no better.
Okay, let me direct that to Ms. Williams too, please.
Congressman Lamalfa, can you ask that question again as far as, would you ask that question?
Was the 4%, is that as brought out in the PERC study, that the recovery for species, Fish and Wildlife predicted would be 4%. So is that an accurate number? Do you agree with?
Congressman Lamalfa, the 3% of what I think that PERC is correct in the number of species delisted, but then again, the 99% are the species that have not gone extinct. And I am aware of Mr. Wood's chart on the trajectory of recovery of species. And I think that it's very accurate that many species, that recovery is a trajectory and it's a continuum, and it doesn't happen overnight due to a number of factors, whether it's climate, habitat fragmentation, habitat loss, disease, overutilization of the species.
Right, thank you. My time has flown by. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Mercazino, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. You know, when people ask me how it is serving in Congress, I usually say it's pretty good. You know, the people are nice, and it's not always as partisan as the media would have you believe. We do work together sometimes. But then there are days like this when some of my colleagues are attacking the Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Act, which has saved some of our country's most iconic symbols, from the bald eagle to the American alligator, multiple species that have been protected by this act. The Endangered Species Act works. 99% of species listed have avoided extinction, as we just heard. And this historic anniversary of the act should also remind us not only of the progress that we've made, but of our need to continue to modernize the Endangered Species Act to align with the realities of climate change and the need to preserve funding in order to actually enforce and implement measures to save our most vulnerable species. Protections under the Environmental Species Act are premised on strong federal-state partnerships, and this is important. We've seen this in our home state of Rhode Island. The orange American burying beetle, one of nature's most efficient composters, once thrived across 35 US states, virtually disappeared during the 20th century, and Block Island, Rhode Island, in my district, was one of the few remaining refuges left. But thanks to the Endangered Species Act, the beetle is now being reintroduced in its former range, and that is just one example. In Rhode Island, the piping plover population is rebounding as well. The number of nesting pairs of the piping plover population has increased 9-fold since 1986, when it was listed. We've heard already about the bald eagle population, which reached nationwide lows of 487 nesting pairs, only 487 in 1963, and have now rebounded dramatically and are back in Rhode Island. That is just another unquestionable Endangered Species Act success. And as a result, the bald eagle was federally delisted in 2007. There is still a risk that climate change will stall the progress we have made, and so we need to update our tools to act on climate change's adverse impacts on species and their habitats. And we see this in Rhode Island, we see it all across the country. Rising sea levels, beach erosion, warming temperatures are threatening numerous species of birds, fish, and other wildlife, and also the Americans that make a living from fishing, including in my district. Climate change threatens them as well. So we do need to update the Endangered Species Act to account for climate risks, but unfortunately, some of my colleagues are trying to move in the opposite direction and water down the ESA and cut the funding that we need to enforce it. And I always think it's important that we not paint with a broad brush, again, because we don't want to be partisan. And I know that many of my colleagues on the other side believe in the Endangered Species Act and don't want to see it watered down. But there are some who, I swear, if there were 5 animals left in a given species, would want to shoot 4 of them and pat themselves on the back for saving the 5th. And we have to move away from that. So, for the sake of vulnerable species impacted by climate change, and also to protect coastal communities like those I represent, we need to support the thousands of people who are working and living in coastal communities who need healthy fish and animal populations, including in order to make a living. Now, Ms. Coit, can you just talk a little bit about how NOAA Fisheries is integrating climate change considerations into the policies that you're putting forward?
Certainly. Thank you for that question. As you mentioned, climate change is negatively affecting threatened and endangered species, and the marine heat waves that we're seeing are particularly serious when it comes to coral reefs and some of our productive habitats. So we are required to make decisions based on the best available science. So we're taking a look at the climate change impacts to the ecosystems and the habitats as part of our decision-making. And we're working on things like the Climate Ecosystem Fisheries Initiative to try to both expand our scientific understanding and do a better job of predicting. Mr. Ash mentioned the loss of sea ice, predicting what's going to happen so that we can make sure that we make decisions that are appropriate for conservation.
And quickly, as we head into appropriation season, can you just speak to the importance of sufficient resources to enforce the act?
Yes, without the resources from the listing decisions to the recovery plans to the consultations that are needed for the projects that support our infrastructure, we're not able to do our jobs. So we need sufficient funding if we're going to succeed in implementing the Endangered Species Act in a way that's going to promote conservation of species and also the economic objectives of this country.
Thank you. I yield back.
Councilwoman Hageman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Since the Endangered Species Act was first passed in 1973, only about 3% of species have been delisted, not because they haven't recovered, but because the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and a variety of environmental groups have a vested interest in keeping them on the list. The gray wolf and the grizzly bear in Wyoming, as well as the gray wolf and the Preble's jumping mouse, are just additional examples of this. In fact, the greater Yellowstone grizzly bear has been recovered for well over a quarter of a century in Wyoming, yet we're still not able to get it delisted. Mr. Brian Nesvik from the Wyoming Game and Fish Department has been at the forefront of these recovery efforts for almost 30 years. He testified just a few months ago on the current state of the greater Yellowstone grizzly. Specifically, he highlighted the fact that the species has not only recovered far beyond the recovery threshold, but has also expanded far beyond its suitable range. Human-bear conflict potential has risen exponentially with this expansion in range. In 2020, nearly 8,000 square miles of grizzly bear range was outside of the designated management area, including on private lands. Just last week, a large male grizzly wandered within 20 miles of Billings, Montana. People now deal directly with grizzly bears that have wandered into rural and agricultural areas. These same people were once promised that the bears would not be allowed to permanently occupy the lands where they work, live, and recreate on a daily basis. And unless we choose to act, this promise will remain broken, and these populations will continue to expand completely unmanaged. The Fish and Wildlife Service, in fact, has found that the greater Yellowstone ecosystem is fully saturated with grizzly bears and that they exceed the numbers that are healthy for that particular area. Director Williams, considering the fact that the state of Wyoming has invested over $59 million in grizzly bear recovery and management, going from 136 bears in 1973 to over 1,100 currently, which is double the recovery numbers that was part of the recovery plan. Do you support transitioning to the Wyoming State Management Plan and delisting the grizzly bear?
Chairman Benz, Congresswoman Hageman, as we've had these conversations before, I absolutely support the transition to state management, and at the same time, the Fish and Wildlife Service must adhere to the 5 factors for delisting for grizzly bears. And we had previously proposed delisting the greater Yellowstone ecosystem for grizzly bears, and the district court rejected that delisting. And now we have a petition before us from Wyoming where we are going through those factors and have to look at not only the numbers of the bears, but also the other factors of the statute. And we are doing that right now.
Ms. Williams, are you intentionally pushing grizzly bears onto private lands?
Chairman Benz, Congressman Hageman, indeed, I am not pushing grizzly bears onto private land. As we know, many of these species do not distinguish between political boundaries or land ownership.
Well, I understand that, but that's why we have recovery plans in geographic areas and identify critical habitat and those sorts of things. You know, Mr. Vibert, I understand your frustrations. Washington, D.C. is full of people who don't understand the on-the-ground situation, whether it has to do with climate or weather or property or vegetation or water. And as a result, they oftentimes are making decisions that are not only based upon the on-the-ground situation, but are actually counterproductive to recovery and protection of the species. And I've seen this in a variety of contexts. So again, I understand the frustration that you have with what's happening to your own property and your own situation. Can you provide us with a bit more detail about how you have been impacted by the Endangered Species Act?
Actually, right before I came in here, I got a phone call from Milborn Seed in South Dakota asking me how my purple coneflower looked this year. I have 110 acres of it. I was supposed to be the guy to put it out for the Monarch Corridor for this next year. And because everything in agriculture, and I know there's some here that are, timing is everything. And we had a period where we had to stop our canals and then go off a live river flow because Wickiup had been completely drained. And I know we're going through a drought. My family's seen lots of them in 131 years, but nothing like this because we have something else sucking it down at a time when it's asleep in the ground. And so I had to tell them I'm not going to have the poundage for them that they wanted because it's a perennial crop and it didn't come up in time during our season. We have a very unique system, a microclimate, 85 degrees during the day, 30 at night. There's only one other place in the world, and that's in Chile, in the shadows of the Andes Mountains. It's going to cost me around $350,000 in lost revenue.
And also an impact on the monarch butterfly.
The gentleman's time has
Thank you,
expired.
I yield back.
Chair recognizes Congressman Byer, 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and thank you for welcoming me to the committee. Director Williams, I think we all recognize that the Endangered Species Act is a balancing act with the many different concerns that citizens have. We've heard again and again today about that only 3% of these species all over these many years have actually been delisted. I think it was Mr. Wood who said in the original legislation, talked about to bring any list of species to the point at which ESA regulations are no longer necessary. What's your perspective on what we have often called the most successful piece of legislation in American history? Is it 99% successful, or is it dramatically disappointing because only 3% have been delisted?
Mr. Chair and Congressman Byer, that's quite a question. I think I would restate that the Endangered Species Act is indeed more important now than ever. And in some respects, it has been remarkably successful in preventing extinction. And what isn't talked about, I think today, we've talked about the species we've prevented from blinking out and those that have been delisted. And in between, there's this continuum of species that need the conservation efforts that come to play with the Endangered Species Act. And I think by and large, those are remarkably successful. They take time, they take work, they take many, many partnerships. And I still think that they're worth it. But as you say, we also at the Fish and Wildlife Service are very careful to be close to communities, paying attention to communities and people, while at the same time following the science and the law. So I think the Endangered Species Act is incredibly important, incredibly successful, but it is a challenge, and it's something that we can always work to improve and work together to do a better job.
Congresswoman Hageman mentioned, when she was asking about the grizzly bear, you mentioned that there were 5 specific goals that had to be. Were these in the legislation? Are they too conservative? Again, asking you, Director Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Congressman Byer. Indeed, they are. They're the 5 factors that are set out in the Endangered Species Act, Section 4, for listing and delisting. They're the same factors. And I think they were prescient, and I think that they are completely applicable today. And some of the challenges of getting to delisting are sometimes the focus on delisting alone instead of the whole continuum of recovery. But I think they are still applicable today.
Thank you. Director Ashland, welcome you back. And your incredible work on ivory in years past was heroic. And we're very grateful for that. You had mentioned, when you were director, we had the blanket 4D rule for fish and wildlife. It was repealed in the Trump administration, replaced in the Biden administration. What's your feeling on it right now? How do you respond to the criticism from my Republican friends that you could, just by treating species as threatened, you can always go to
an endangered species for individual species that really need it. That we restrict our flexibility by doing the blanket rule.
I think that in my view, the Fish and Wildlife Service's ability to promulgate a special rule, a 4D rule for a threatened species, and the framework they set in place where when you list a species as threatened, the default is that all of the protections of the law apply unless you sculpt them to the needs of that species. And I think the Fish and Wildlife Service then and the Fish and Wildlife Service now is very innovative in the application of 4D rules. And as an administrator, I would say it's much better position to be in to be loosening a restriction than adding a restriction from an administrative and a regulatory standpoint. So I applaud them for reinstating that rule. I think it makes actually the threatened species designation meaningful, but also allows you to sculpt the regulations as necessary.
Thank you very much. And Director Williams, again, one of the things that former Director Ash complained about was the incredible delay times on permits. Why is that? What can we do at Fish and Wildlife to make permitting happen in a non-bureaucratic way?
Mr. Chair, Congressman Beyer, thanks for that question. I mean, I think Mr. Ash provided one of the answers in that our international affairs program has been chronically starved and not always supported by other administrations. So I have worked very hard to reconstitute that program, provide them the leadership that they need, and we have been having meetings with AZA to try to get to a better spot with our permits. But we have been understaffed. These are complicated, and I think we can find a better path forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Congresswoman Boebert for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wood, can you please elaborate on why the Biden administration rescinding important ESA reforms made by the Trump administration that modernized the ESA, including the regulatory definition of habitat, are misguided and bad for rural America?
Sure. As I discussed in my written testimony and discussed today, the only place critical habitat can really provide value is areas where the land triggers that federal nexus. It's going to require a federal permit to damage existing habitat features. It cannot serve to encourage the restoration of habitat or the active maintenance of habitat. Rescinding the Trump's definition of habitat, which we had some disagreements with on the margin, but was overall correct in saying habitat is only those areas suitable for a species, serves to make it easier to designate precisely those areas where critical habitat doesn't work, and worse, creates perverse incentives by making the potential to establish habitat a liability for landowners.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to you in just a second. Director Williams, should the gray wolf be delisted in the lower 48?
Mr. Chair, Congresswoman Boebert, and we are in the midst of petitions and litigation on that very issue.
Would you agree that they need to be delisted?
When they meet the 5 criteria of the
So there are
Endangered
over
Species Act,
6,000
yes.
wolves in the lower 48 United States, and the initial agency recovery goal was 650 wolves. So both Obama and the Biden administrations have supported delisting the gray wolf, including when Mr. Ash was director. It shouldn't take an act of Congress or more than a decade to delist a recovered species. So I would say that has met that criteria, and you're saying once it meets that criteria, then yes, it should be delisted. And I would say that this takes away from our precious resources from other species that actually need our help that are on the Endangered Species Act. And Mr. Wood, back to you. Are you aware of a statutory provision that authorizes Fish and Wildlife Service to require mitigation under Section 7?
Nothing that explicitly requires it, but under Section 7, they have to consult over federal projects.
Okay, or do you agree that Section 7 does not include the words mitigation or offsets, and such requirements for Section 7 were never authorized by Congress?
I believe with the first part, from what I understand, often mitigation is proposed by federal agencies as a way to avoid more extensive consultation, so there's some uncertainty there, but you're right that the words, I believe, don't appear in that section
Thank
of the
you.
statute.
Director Williams, why did Fish and Wildlife Service not allow public review and not allow public comment for its recently released ESA compensatory mitigation policy?
Mr. Chair, Congresswoman Bobert, I follow the Administrative Procedures Act, the law, when we put forward any rulemaking, and I don't believe that the APA applies to mitigation policies. So we did follow the law in putting those forward.
Why is it that the Fish and Wildlife Service is proposing to burden landowners with onerous ESA-related prohibitions when the agency has insufficient information to support a listing of the dunes sagebrush lizard?
Mr. Chair, Congresswoman Bobert, indeed, I have spent a long time, a career of working even on the dune sagebrush lizard. I'm looking at my previous colleague, Mr. Ash, and the science was very clear on the dune sagebrush lizard. In fact, I brought with me the proposed listing. What happened with dune sagebrush lizard is for many years, it's an example of the positive conservation outcomes of the possibility of a listing happening. That didn't happen, and they could be extinct in all of their range.
So I would say this is yet another species of whom it appears the Fish and Wildlife Service is basing a listing decision on the precautionary principle. The service appears to be speculating about the future trends, even while it admits it can't be certain because of the species habitat and it's on private lands.
If that's a question, Congresswoman Bobert, indeed, a threatened status talks about foreseeable future, but endangered status does not. Those are threats before us right now to the dune sagebrush lizard
As long as we could get
habitat.
the actual recovered species off of the list, then I think we can make a lot of progress. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Thank you. Chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. It shouldn't be too surprising that the caption of our hearing prompted defensive remarks, but that wasn't the goal. The goal is to have folks who know talk about the cost that this act imposes over and above that which the agencies are spending. And so I'm just going to ask first, Director Williams, if you believe that the ESA listing of the frog has cost the Oregon community money. We've heard a very clear statement of it from one of our witnesses today. I simply need somebody from the government to acknowledge that this law is causing communities and others to bear a cost. Can you say that that is the case?
Mr. Chair, indeed, today I have heard that, and I look forward to visiting even more. And there can be costs to communities, and there, as we discussed yesterday,
Yes,
there
let's go.
also can be
There have
benefits.
been enormous costs. Let's talk about the spotted owl. Can you give us the cost to the forest industry in Oregon of the listing of the spotted owl?
Mr. Chair, indeed, that happened before my time
Would
as
you agree
the
that it
director.
would you agree that it was in the billions?
In the millions or
Billions.
in the billions? I do not know the answer to the direct cost.
Okay, how about the indirect cost? I simply need the agencies who are in charge of this law to acknowledge that it costs, when implemented, billions of dollars in many situations, especially when we talk about our forests. Can you agree with that?
Mr. Chair, as we talked about, yes, we produce reports.
No, stop. I've got the report right here. I'm about to ask you about it.
Great.
I want to know about the impact of your implementation of the Endangered Species Act. Does it cost communities, in many cases, billions? And by the way, your cohort needs to get ready because I'm going to ask her the same question, Deputy Administrator.
Mr. Chair, I cannot answer that question. That
That's
it
fine.
costs
Okay,
billions.
I take it that one of the things I am going to suggest, and as I told you yesterday, propose an amendment to the Endangered Species Act At the very end, last paragraph, where you're to provide a report on your cost, I think you should also be reporting on society's cost in general. And again, I don't want to get into a debate about the benefits. Those are already a given by virtue of the existence of the law. Deputy Administrator Coit, NOAA Fisheries published a recovery plan for the right whale in 2005 that stated the total estimated cost to recover cannot be determined as it will likely take numerous decades and many management activities that are currently impossible to predict. Studies, however, show that vessel speed restrictions, which are being proposed by your agency, the whale could result, these restrictions could result in a loss of 340,000 American jobs and nearly 84 billion in economic contributions. Do you agree or disagree?
Those are not numbers that I can agree with. We have an economic assessment of the cost of the proposed vessel speed rule, and we are updating that as we look at the comments in the rule, but it is nowhere near that number.
Yes, if I recall correctly, it was like 24 million as
believe-
opposed to 84 billion. So you're off just a bit. I want to shift to Mr. Johns. I know up in my part of the world in Oregon, the local utilities had to move all of their power lines away from crossing vast expanses of sagebrush and over adjacent to county roads, following the county roads in the most Jabberwocky way I've ever seen in my life, the purpose of which was to assist the sage grouse, we hope. There is no doubt in the world that the ratepayers are paying for that. Is the same thing true? Is your utility having to pay for protections, shall we say, implemented by those in charge of the Endangered Species Act?
At this point, we haven't had to do a lot of that, but I have to tell you that as I sat here today and listened to the commentary from my fellow witnesses, I'm reminded of President Reagan's comment, in the current crisis, government is not the solution, government is the problem. And I think, as we think about the Endangered Species Act and the intention of it, it is meant to improve the situation, is meant to save these resources. And the voluntary acts of organizations like East Central Energy are moving forward without government intervention, and they're solving the problem. We are envisioning a habitat in our rights of way that promote monarch habitat, that promote diversity of species, and we're doing all of it without the restrictions.
And I'm
of
very
government.
happy that you're doing that, but the purpose of this hearing is to call out the cost of the act and so that people don't just blithely overlook that which is imposed upon the folks that have to bear the burden, many of them in the West, of these acts. With that, yield back, and I recognize Congressman Pfluger for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for letting me wave onto this committee. As you know, I represent the 11th Congressional District in Texas, which encompasses a large part of the Permian Basin in West Texas. Extremely disappointed to see the dunes, sagebrush, lizard, as a listed endangered species at this point. The day before we celebrated our nation's independence, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service announced that it would be proposing the listing of the dune sagebrush lizard as an endangered species under the ESA. And I believe this is once again, Mr. Chairman, an attack, a weaponization of an agency, a federal agency, and specifically against the most prolific energy producing region in the world. I do have many questions, but before I get to them, there has been a tremendous effort both by the state and private stakeholders and initiatives to protect this particular species. And quite frankly, this proposal is a slap in the face of conservationists who are in that area, who have lived and worked in that area for many, many years, who know that area. And like many other agencies that I talk to, the response I get when was the last time you visited the Permian Basin? And I'll ask you, Director Williams, when was the last time you visited the Permian Basin?
Mr. Chair, Congressman Pfluger, I lived in Oklahoma for a long time, but I have not visited it in the past 2 years.
Thank you. Okay. And that's generally, Mr. Chairman, the response I get. Director Williams, is this listing in response to a negotiated settlement?
Mr. Chair, no, this listing is not in response to a negotiated settlement. It's due to the science and the law.
Were there other private parties that were part of this listing?
Mr. Chair, no, in fact, the service, well, there are private parties who the service has worked with over decades, like you mentioned, where we have worked to streamline compliance options like candidate conservation agreements, safe harbor agreements, habitat conservation plans. So we have been working with private parties in these conservation efforts.
And Director Williams, what, are you an advocate for renewable energy?
Mr. Chair, Congressman, indeed, yes, renewable energy is important.
Can you tell us the impact that this will have on renewable sources of energy such as wind and solar and the building of wind and solar?
Mr. Chair, Congressman Pfluger, there are times where the Fish and Wildlife Service, we make our decisions based on the science and the law and are working with individuals the best we can to ameliorate any impact. In this instance, the loss of Shinnery oak habitat that the dune sagebrush lizard relies on is irreversible. We've not found a way to recreate that habitat.
Will you provide the committee with a list of peer review group representatives, their affiliations that reviewed the dune sagebrush lizard?
Mr. Chair, Congressman Pfluger, absolutely.
You know, you talk about the science. I'm questioning your science. I'm going to go ahead and just say it out loud. I'm questioning your science here because a report on the DSL done at the end of 2022 shows that there has been a net conservation gain for this particular species. And these private and state-led conservation efforts are working, yet the service still listed the DSL, the dune sagebrush lizard. So how does the service decide to list a species where 98% of the lands are privately have a private supplemental conservation effort?
Mr. Chair, Congressman Pfluger, it's wonderful when conservation agreements can help with the species, and indeed, perhaps, you know, there are benefits to that, but not enough to bring the species to the point where it doesn't need to be listed.
You know, there have been hundreds of millions of dollars spent in an effort to do real conservation. And I'm questioning, because you haven't been to the Permian Basin recently, and I'm very disappointed in that, to tell you the truth. Similar to the Secretary of Energy, similar to FERC, similar to the EPA, similar to many other agencies, but will you please answer this? Was this species listed in an attempt to kill the fossil fuel industry?
Mr. Chair, Congressman Pfluger, absolutely not.
So you will share the peer-reviewed documents and the science, because the stakeholders in my area who have a vested interest in providing affordable, reliable energy to this country have reported back that none of that has actually been done, that the stakeholder communication, that the work between Fish and Wildlife, the state and local level has not happened. So I am questioning your science, and Mr. Chairman, I'd like to see the documents, the peer-reviewed documents that Fish and Wildlife Service has.
Mr. Chair, Congressman Pfluger, as the director of the Fish and Wildlife Service, I do want to take this opportunity to support the hardworking employees of the Fish and Wildlife Service and the science and the work that they put into this, and that is not questionable. You may question me, but I will not question the
My time has expired, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
employees.
I yield back.
Thank you. And with that, I thank the witnesses for their testimony and the members for their questions. Members may have additional questions for the witnesses, and I ask that they respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3, members of the committee must submit questions to the subcommittee clerk by 1 p.m. Eastern Time on Friday, June 9th. The hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there's no further business, without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.